Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you at this program. If I could just give a little background on what CRSJ is doing in this issue area and sort of what led to this program, I'd appreciate it. So CRSJ created a program called Perfecting Democracy, Lawyers as Changemakers, and really what that's about is trying to channel the great gifts and skills that lawyers have towards protecting and ensuring voting rights for all Americans. And what we really want people to understand is we're seeking volunteer lawyers is you do not need to have experience in election law, voting rights, or any of that. Really all you need is a personal drive to want to make a difference. So that's really what the focus of all the work that we've been doing is. And leading up to the 2020 election cycle, we partnered with the Lawyers Defense Fund, and you all were great. We put out some pleas, and I think we placed about 80-some lawyers in about a week and a half period. It was sort of a crunch time as we were waiting to find places to place attorneys. So I want to let you know that there is a QR code out there about our national program to recruit lawyers. And where we are right now is we're collecting names, but we're not going to connect you with organizations yet because those organizations are still sort of trying to figure out where their needs are. So we don't want to collect a bunch of names and then send them someplace and you don't get any traction, because it's not helpful to you, it's not helpful to the organization. So we're really trying to work in concert with these organizations to do it the right way. And even though I said you don't personally need experience, I can assure you that when we place you with someone, you will get the training that you need. So, if you're a transactional lawyer, the other thing is these organizations, they might need someone who also can use your particular skill set. But maybe they just need people to answer the phone, or they need people to be poll watchers and to be there on election day. So there's really a wealth of opportunities. And the other thing that we found is, especially in this day and age, there's actually quite a bit of opportunity for remote monitoring. So even if you can't, say, be in Arizona or you can't be in Florida, they are looking for volunteers to sort of be looking at social media and to be looking at things as far as misinformation and disinformation and let them know, and they will also train you in those various aspects. So CRSJ is so delighted to be doing this work, and I'm so heartened by the turnout. I know how hard it is at an annual meeting. People are coming and going from here to there, and sometimes, the places aren't that close. So we're very grateful for your interest and your commitment to this issue. So thank you for that. And then we're so pleased that at the Thurgood Marshall Award dinner tonight, John Echohawk is going to receive the award. And so we thought it would be really fitting to do a program on the state of Native American voting rights and pro bono opportunities. So I'm honored and delighted to welcome Patty Ferguson Bohnee from Arizona State University, and Jacqueline de León, who is with the Native American Rights Foundation Fund. And so I apologize, I have another commitment. I'm on the council of the section of state and local government law, and they need a quorum so they can vote on different issues. So I'm going to leave it in the extremely capable hands of Patty and Jacqueline. Thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. I'm happy to assist in this discussion. Jacqueline and I are going to be leading the discussion, but we really want to have input from everyone about what we can be doing moving forward and collectively. And just by way of background, Native Americans in the United States became citizens in 1924, but they weren't allowed to exercise the right to vote until much later. And it really depended on the state that they were in, even though, for example, in Arizona, Native Americans were successful in litigating the right to vote in 1948. They weren't able to exercise that right until the literacy requirements were removed through the Voting Rights Act in 1970. So Native Americans really didn't start voting until 1970 in Arizona, and then once they did, there were many barriers to prevent them from voting or having them elected, or gerrymandering to prevent their votes from counting. So there have been a lot of opposition to voting. And then on the Native side, sometimes there's a question as to why should I be participating in this democracy that doesn't recognize me or my voice. And so there's efforts to get out the vote and to educate on why it's important to participate, because in fact, like, the federal government is making decisions about your lives every day when you're a Native person. And in the state, there's a lot of also regulation that impacts you. And so there's a lot of education efforts from the tribes to get people to participate. And we see in states that it makes a difference. So in the last election in Arizona, the tribal vote totally made a difference in the turnout. In the 2020 election also. And so as people see that the Native vote makes a difference, there's also challenges where people are trying to prevent that vote from making a difference. In addition to that, there's many other barriers, which I'm going to have Jacqueline discuss, but I just want to, make sure that we're all on the level playing field, because sometimes people think, well, why is it different for Natives than anyone else? And so, and what are the challenges to providing services in Native communities if you do want to participate, to protect the right to vote and exercise that right to vote? So one of the things that happened is that there are, in Arizona, we're doing a lot of work to protect the right to vote. There were groups in Alaska, South Dakota, working on these issues, filing litigation. There hasn't been very much federal litigation from the U.S. government, DOJ, bringing active cases on behalf of tribes. So a lot of this was being done by tribes themselves who lack resources, or the Native American Rights Fund or the ACLU Voting Rights Project. So in 2015, there was an effort to bring groups together under the umbrella of the Native American Voting Rights Coalition, which was organized through the Native American Rights Fund, to say, we're all working on these things. We have similar issues. We need to recognize what we're doing over here, you're doing this over here. Can we share resources and strategy so we can think about how to move forward? And one of the things that we recognize is that there wasn't a lot of data or resources about Native voters. So whenever there were discussions about voting rights, a lot of times Native people weren't being included. So we wanted to create a dialogue and coordinated strategy. And the goals were to remove barriers, increase civic engagement, and have more informed and active electorate. So there was an initial survey of 5 states that focused on what are the barriers to voting, and some of them were like, well, we don't have access to voter registration. We don't feel like we should be participating in these elections. We don't trust the government, so why should we be participating? So there were a lot of views that had never really been captured before. And then when people did try to participate, then they were also discouraged from participating, or their registration wasn't submitted, because you have very well-intended groups, voter registration groups, that go out to reservations, but somehow people submit that information and it's never, not brought to the county, or something happens at the county and you're never registered. And so when you go to vote and you're not registered, you feel like, I'm so embarrassed, I'm not going to come back, right? So that becomes a problem. But then in addition to that, there were field hearings in 2017 and 2018, about 9 field hearings, so there's 120 witnesses, to capture the barriers and experiences of Native American voters. So I'm going to turn to Jacqueline, because I issued a report. I think it's called Obstacles at Every Turn. And just to highlight some of those barriers so that people can understand the things that Native voters are facing in Indian country.
Thanks so much, and hi everyone. Thanks again for participating. So I'm Jacqueline de León. I'm a member of the SLEDA Pueblo. I am a staff attorney or senior attorney with the Native American Rights Fund, and I lead our voting rights practice group. We're a team that does a bunch of election protection. We lead the Native American Voting Rights Coalition. We advocate for the Native American Voting Rights Act, which I'll get into a little bit later, and we also litigate nationally on laws that have been cropping up that have been disenfranchising Native voters. And, you know, as Patty mentioned, I co-led a series of field hearings on behalf of the Native American Voting Rights Coalition, 9 in total, to sort of investigate the issue of why it's so difficult for Native Americans to vote. So this is really, what's really surprising, I think, about those hearings is the consistent picture that emerged, right? So, you know, there's 574 recognized tribes. They're geographically distinct. They are all over the country. And yet we saw a very consistent picture and a lot of consistent stories emerging. And so we kind of broke them down into a few categories. The first is the structural barriers, right? So obviously Native Americans were often displaced and put in rural areas, you know, very far from a lot of infrastructure. And so when you have a community that has dirt roads, that does not have addressed homes, is not receiving residential mail delivery, you can imagine how that would make it difficult to register to vote if you don't have an address on your home, and you can imagine how difficult it would be to get a ballot. And then, you know, I think what we're seeing again and again is that unfortunately, the distances to polling places are unreasonably far. We're seeing that people have to travel to a border town as opposed to on reservation in a precinct where they reside to vote, right? So you have all of these structural barriers compounded by extreme poverty, where folks don't have vehicle access and they don't have the money for a tank of gas, that are expected to travel 20, 30, 40, 50 miles to get to a polling place, right? And people, unsurprisingly, are making the rational decision that it's not worth it, right? And I think also what the distances are communicating and the lack of services are communicating, right, over and over again, is that you're not invited to participate, right? If you aren't seeing a polling place in your community, in places that you frequent, I think what's being very clearly communicated to you is that you're not invited to this system, right? That this isn't for you. And so when we see the attitude emerge that why should I participate, that's also a structural consequence, right? A consequence of these structural deficiencies. So, you know, we saw that consistent pattern emerge of just polling places, registration opportunities, early voting access, extremely limited on reservation, right? Then we have the compounding problem of where the actual services are border towns. And unfortunately, what we know in Indian country is those border towns can be extremely racist. And the people that are in charge of running the elections can come from those border towns, and they can also be extremely racist. And I say that they are extremely racist because we have stories directly from people talking about how when they enter to vote, the entire room falls silent and everybody stares at them until they cast their vote. How the polling place that was assigned to them in 2012 in South Dakota was a chicken coop that had feathers on the floor that was meant to communicate disrespect. That in a border town before the 2022 election, in that town, adjacent to the Fort Peck Reservation, the winner of the Halloween costume contest was a man in full KKK regalia. That was the winner on October 31st, and the election was, November 2nd or whatever it is, right? And so the idea of having to travel to extremely hostile places to cast a ballot is obviously not an appealing option, right? So we see that, and we see that the people that are administering those elections come from families, small towns, where there are, additional hostilities, and so people aren't willing to engage in that, unsurprisingly. And then we see a sort of disturbing trend recently of, with the perpetuation of the myth of voter fraud, has been this idea that we have to have, increasing laws that are aimed at, supposedly protecting against fraud, but don't actually correlate in any way with the harms that they're supposedly trying to prevent against, right? But what they do is take advantage of the structural deficiencies that I just explained. You know, we in Arizona right now, we are litigating against, you know, a registration requirement of a residential address. Well, guess what? Thousands of Native Americans in Arizona don't have residential addresses. You know, that's a vote denial claim, I think, akin to a literacy test. And we did that same test, you know, we did that same case in North Dakota, where they required a residential address on IDs when they knew that there were Native Americans in North Dakota that don't have residential addresses. So what we're seeing, you know, is, you know, structural barriers because of the difficulties navigating Native American communities. Then we see hostility in border towns, and then we see laws taking advantage of those structural deficiencies, supposedly race neutral, but have an outsized impact on Native Americans. And so, you know, I think those are an outline of sort of the barriers broadly that we're facing. Obviously, it varies from precinct to precinct. It also, you know, I think it would surprise you when you go to look up your polling place, your local polling place. The message that we hear is that it's extremely easy. I can tell you, as somebody who's been trying to track down every single polling place in Indian country, it is extremely difficult to find out where your polling place is if you reside on a reservation. That information is not readily available anywhere. And you have to call the county. You have to ask when the early voting is available. They often don't know or won't tell you, you know, and there isn't any registration opportunity. And you have to go to your county seat, again, located in that border town. So there's a lot of barriers that we're facing. NARF will be kicking off another election protection effort. We are going to be, last year we had 40 attorneys or law students poll watching in 20 locations. We send people in pairs. We want to dramatically increase that poll watching program. It's really necessary, especially in rural areas, and we will, you know, pay for flights, hotel, and car. And so if you're interested in that sort of opportunity, please reach out. There's a link on the list that we have in the resources in the ABA guide that will allow you to fill in your information and your interest. And please distribute that among your networks.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacqueline. That leadership for election protection is very important. I'm in Arizona, so we created the Arizona Native Vote Election Protection Project in 2008. And that was basically created in response to the voter ID law that was passed in Arizona because Native voters were being turned away because they didn't have, or the poll workers didn't recognize their IDs. Even though they had IDs, they wouldn't accept the ID, even though the law was litigated to expand the types of IDs. So we wanted to ensure that Native people could vote, exercise their vote, and have that vote be counted. And a lot of that has to do with education of the poll workers and the poll worker training. So on the off season, we do a lot of work with the counties to educate them. And as you can imagine, there's been a lot of turnover in elections because of what has been happening in elections. And so we're going into an election season with a lot of new county officials and then a lot of new poll workers. And so we have to be continually educating because what Jacqueline mentioned is in Arizona is that most tribal people do not have residential street addresses. So my primary residence is on the reservation. I have a made-up address, basically, and it's on my Arizona driver's license. And the tribe had worked with the county to place everyone in the address, or in the precincts. And so if I look up my voter registration on the VAN, the Voter Activation Network, everyone who lives in that tribal district has the same address. So it's the address of the service center for the tribe in that district. But we would never have an ID card with that address on it. So a lot of it is educating people that, okay, if the address reasonably matches, you should allow this voter to cast a ballot. And that's why it's so important to have election protection workers in the field on election day, because if you have new poll workers, they may not recognize that. Another big issue with tribal communities in Arizona is that many of them are precincted, which means if you vote outside of your precinct, well, everything is precincted, but they don't have vote centers where you have in other places, but you have to vote in your precinct. And if you don't vote in your precinct, your ballot doesn't count. So sometimes the county does not place the voter in a precinct, and they're not even on the roll, even though they've registered to vote. And so it's ensuring that under the Help America Vote Act, that these voters are given the ballot that they're required by law and allowed to exercise that vote. Or if they're a tribal voter, they most likely have a post office box that isn't located where they live, because there are only limited number of post office boxes. So the county may place them outside of where they live. So, working with the poll workers and educating them, okay, no, you must allow this voter to vote in this precinct because this is the precinct where they live. But what happens is sometimes tribal members are placed in the wrong county. And so if they vote in the wrong county, then their vote won't be counted. So the election protection workers are very important for accepting tribal IDs, dealing with that results from the non-traditional addresses, making sure that they receive the provisional ballots, and dealing with these administrative issues. But we also have language compliance under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. Sometimes the translators are not available, even though they should be available. So alerting the county, making sure that they provide those translations. Intimidation is very important to report that, to have the election protection workers. So at the last election, just give an example, we had a candidate on a reservation precinct with a gun. And on the reservation, no one is allowed to have a gun. It's not stateside. It's not like you can bring your gun on the reservation. And obviously, we don't want our election protection workers to engage with that, but they can report that to us, and then we can have the tribal police respond, report it to the county. But there's more and more intimidation that's happening. Before we saw that, in some places in Arizona, and other places in any country, it's too far to really send out, people who are going to disrupt. But as we see that the native vote makes a difference, we have more and more partisan poll watchers who are well-intended, and they are well-intended, but they may follow a voter and ask them a question, and the voter's like, who are you? Why are you talking to me? So making sure they respect the rules of the place and the culture that they're in. And so then they can report that to us, and we can contact the county or the party so they can address that. But the other really important thing about our election protection workers is making sure the polls are open on time and don't close early, because that happens. So almost every election, we're filing a lawsuit to extend the polling location hours because the polls have not opened on time. And again, if you can only vote in your precinct, that means that you can't vote. And if you're in Indian country and you work an hour away, you can't stop at any polling locations along the way. So this voter has been disenfranchised. So what Jacqueline was mentioning about the polling location issues, we created a polling locator tool for Arizona, which basically means we identified the coordinates of every polling location in the state of Arizona. Primarily, we're focused on Indian country, but we do it for everyone because they have these fancy tools, find my poll, all this kind of things. But if you have a non-traditional polling location or a non-traditional address at a polling location, those are not populated. And so that helps our voters find their polling location, and our volunteers assist those volunteers. And so we have our election protection program in Arizona. Anybody here can volunteer. We provide training. All the election protection programs provide training. We have our own hotline so that we can address issues in real time. And we work with in-house tribal councils So in-house attorneys for the tribe, so that they're working with us on the reservation. They know we're sending people to the reservation, and we're coordinating with the county saying this is where we're sending people, so that they know who our volunteers are and where we're going on election day. They have other states who have their own programs in Indian country. The Oklahoma Indian Bar Association has a program. New Mexico Native Vote has a program, so I'm glad our New Mexico friends are here, because I know that they want to incorporate local attorneys who can assist in a program in Indian country in New Mexico, because there's just a lot of confusion, and it's very helpful to have election protection volunteers. And you don't have to have any experience in elections to be election protection volunteers. We send our 1Ls out to the polls, and they'll call us. They're like, this is happening. And I'm like, okay, go back in the poll and tell the poll worker XYZ. Are you sure? I said, yes, you can do this. So you don't have to be a lawyer, but we usually pair our law students with lawyers, right? So that they feel confident, and lawyers are more confident even if they may not know the particular area of law. They are very more confident, and they are going to be more willing to approach. But so what Jacqueline is saying is that she is working across Indian country, and y'all have some gaps you've identified. Like, what are those states?
Like I said, we are happy to fly folks out, and then have them rent a vehicle and take a hotel so they can make the hours, because we're getting to fairly remote areas, right? But I think in this next election, we're really looking to expand our presence in Wisconsin, Nevada, Montana, Michigan, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and we haven't decided whether or not we're going to try and tackle Alaska. That might be another year. But, I think there's quite a few states there that we've done in previous years, but if we can expand our footprint, we'd really like to.
And what we see from the election protection volunteers is that sometimes if you don't have that volunteer there, people will leave because someone has told them that they cannot vote, you're not on the roll. And if they leave, they're not coming back. If they're calling a hotline and somebody doesn't answer and they're waiting for a response, they're not coming back. But if you're there and you're able to answer their questions, because people are embarrassed and they're like, oh, I must have did something wrong. No, you didn't do anything wrong. You have a right as a voter, and so you're empowering voters. So I would like Makalika for you to talk about what National NABA is planning to do for the 2024 election. You have a mic right there.
There's a switch on the back here.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Aloha, everyone. Oh, that's very loud. I'm Makalika. I'm this year's president of the National Native American Bar, so it's a pleasure to see everyone, especially members and past presidents in the room, including Patty. So the NABA actually historically has done, I'll just be candid, in recent years, not very much on voting protection. Because it's mostly been handled locally with our affiliates. And so, our members are certainly doing it, but mostly doing it through their affiliates, not necessarily through something coordinated at the national NABA level. The ABA actually was able to get some funding to coordinate and support some of their affiliate bars, like the National Native American Bar, to do more in this space. And so we're actually just figuring out the nuances of what it looks like. Blair, who was a voting rights fellow working with Patty for 2 years before she finished her fellowship just now, will be leading this because she has such fresh and deep expertise on native voting rights. So the two of us are figuring it out, but basically the rough sketch of it is what we'd like to do is convene all of the regional affiliates, work with existing protect and advance native vote groups like Jacqueline and that collective that she mentioned, to figure out just basically how to create the right network to share and expand what's happening. So I think if we were to look at a map of where the activity is happening, I think it would be not consistently deep in every region, right? So for NABA, we have 8 affiliates. Folks in the room might know them, but roughly Northwest, Hawaii, California, Arizona, Denver, Minnesota, and DC, right? That's basically our affiliates. So compared to maybe some of the other bars of color, ours is a shorter list. But each of those either has a state or a multi-state region. And in the multi-state regions, for sure, they're trying to cover a lot of different tribal communities. And then even in the state regions, there's usually Hawaii is probably the one exception to that, because in Hawaii, we're mostly just thinking about Hawaiians. So across the country, there's different depths of sophistication of this work that's being done, at least driven by the bars. And I think that Patty is a great example of incredibly sophisticated, probably gold standard work that's been driven out of NABA AZ. And then on the other end of the spectrum, like candidly, I think in the Northwest and in Hawaii, probably a lot less to probably nothing, frankly. Those actually are both rooted in places where they have mail-in vote, and so some of that affects some of the dynamics. But anyways, what we'd like to do is just facilitate more of a coordinated way for lawyers through the bar associations to participate in this work and help the regions learn from each other, take gold standard models like what they've got going on in Arizona. I think they're also doing sophisticated work in Oklahoma and in Minnesota, and bring that more universally across if there is that capacity and interest. But interest is usually not the problem, it's usually capacity. And so one of the things that I think we're always doing in Native communities is figuring out, well, how can you just expand something that someone else has done that's working really well, right? Because capacity is such a concern. So for anyone in the room who's interested in working on that, I think what that's gonna look like is, one, if you're working with one of the regional Native bars, that's where the call is next, is, will you participate in this effort to try to coordinate across through this community? And we are planning a voting rights summit at the FedBar Indian Law Conference in April, where we're going to try to bring everyone from those affiliates who is going to take a leadership role for their local community in, do the information sharing, and then come up with what are going to be our plans between April and November to really specifically focus on the really important elections happening in November of next year. And then, of course, trying to collect information afterwards about the outcomes and what difference did we make. So really, I think it'll look similar. The kinds of activity you do will probably look really similar to what Patty was just describing, because we're actually hoping that with contributions from people like Patty, we'll just be doing a lot more of that. Instead of it just being like, this is what we do in Arizona, or this is what we do in Oklahoma, it'll be more like, this is what through NABA, our community of Native lawyers and bar associations are providing nationally for Native communities.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so there is infrastructure in place, and we do work with the national partners who are doing election protection, and we help them and share training materials, but usually we're inputting like, oh, here in this state, they have a law particular to Native voting IDs. Make sure you put this in your materials for your election protection volunteers in that state, because they need to know this. So we review that information because we feel like a big part of our job is educating and sharing, and when there's other infrastructures in place, we want to work with them and partner with them, and so we do. And so we have huge command centers on election day with our partners. So we have a hotline, but we have people in the field. And I'm not really sure how it works in all the other states, how big their command centers are, but you can tell them what you do.
Well, I can speak a little bit too. So we also partner with 1866 Our Vote, and we have a Native specific category to indicate if you're located on Native lands, and then those calls all get directed to NARF. So we also have a similar command center where we're fielding those calls. So we do promote that 1866 Our Vote number as well.
So I think at this point it would be great to open it up to see if people have thoughts or ideas of how we can work collaboratively, or if you have ideas about working in Indian country or partnering, that would be fantastic. Well, look, you have a mic right there.
Probably don't need it, but I'll use it. I guess this is a combination question thought. I run a nonprofit public service law firm in San Diego, as you know, Patty, and San Diego has the largest number of Indian tribes in the country. Do you know what's going on there in regard to this work, and if there's any help that our firm can provide?
So we partner with California Native Vote. Christy Castro is an organizer that works throughout California. Happy to put you in touch with her. And then also we could work together. We're promoting in California a registration opportunity through 638 run IHS facilities. So this is a quick detour, but I do think it's actually kind of useful. President Biden issued an executive order that directed federal agencies to offer registration where possible and become designated under the National Voter Registration Act, the NVRA. And through that, we thought, IHS, Indian Health Services, is a prime location to start offering registration, right? It really services the populations that are underserved. In IHS, tribes do a process called 638 compacting, where they can take over running the facilities themselves. And in so doing, they also have the discretion to become NVRA designated. And so the Shingle Springs Rancheria in Northern California is going to be designated on August 22nd, which is an exciting thing. And we hope to roll it out aggressively in partnership with the Secretary of State to other 638 compacting facilities throughout California. So if you have relationships in that area, we would be happy to talk, because I think a lot of them do run their healthcare facilities, and we're hoping to offer that increased registration opportunity. And so other folks that some of the people, so some people that aren't necessarily Native utilize these IHS facilities in rural areas, and would also benefit from those registration opportunities. So if anybody has, any contact or knowledge of those types of facilities, pass them along to us, and we can help them on that path toward designation.
Yeah, and I think you raised also a good point that I didn't think about, is through the relocation program, a lot of natives live in urban areas, like most natives live off the reservation, actually. And so within these states, we do identify where there are large numbers of natives, and also the urban Indian organizations that can help with voter reg or election protection. So there would be certain resources that the California Native Vote already works with that I think that Jacqueline can help plug you, because they're part of the coalition, right? Yeah.
Just a quick another California resource. California Indian Legal Services as well has been doing a lot of work around voter education and protection. So in combination with Christy at the California Native Vote Project and CILS, who has an office still in Escondido, I believe, they're doing a lot of work around this too. So that could be another partner for the San Diego area.
And I think the goal is to have a main location to filter people through. And so Jacqueline has created a registration so you can identify where you are. Like if you want to do something greater and coordinate, that's great. But if you're like, oh, I just want to do election protection on election day, you can sign up for that link. I'm going to send it to Paula. It'll be on the website. And you can say, where you live, and where you want to be, and where you're willing to go on election day.
Yeah, and use the comment box liberally.
Yeah.
I think, please feel free to say whatever you like. I'll be looking at them.
Yeah.
So one of the things I'm wondering is, do you have any numbers for us? Like, what is the undercount of those members of tribes or pueblos that are eligible to vote, but we're not getting those numbers? Because that's really helpful for getting to the Secretary of State's office.
Help me. Help me. Okay, so there are many problems with the census. There is a huge census undercount, especially in 2020, because a lot of reservations were closed. New Mexico, the reservations were closed. Arizona, the reservations were closed. So the census did not start really on time, and then they were not doing what they needed to do because, they're since they would have to go house to house. People have these P.O. boxes, and it's a mess. So in some places, give you an example, like it will say, like they have, according to the census, like 100 people live here, but you have like 200 people registered to vote. So obviously the census is wrong, right? So it's very hard to use the census to figure out how many people aren't registered in that area. Like it doesn't, we try in Arizona all the time, we're like, oh my gosh, this doesn't make sense at all. And I'm sure it's gonna be similar for the Pueblos and Apaches in New Mexico where y'all are located. So the best way to do that is to work with the tribe to figure out how many on-reservation members that they have over the age of 18, and then how many people are registered in that precinct. Sometimes the counties want the tribes to share their data, and as you can imagine, the tribes are not very willing to say, yes, we'll let you have access to all of this personal data of individuals because
Oh, just real quick, I do have a point on the personal. So Colorado is piloting a program right now that allows a tribe to voluntarily give a membership list to be automatically enrolled. So they passed a state law to allow that. Now, that data would not go beyond registration, right? So at that point, after that, the membership list would, revert back to the tribe. But I just wanted, and certainly a volunteer basis, and you wouldn't want to ever suggest that a tribe has to share its membership list with you or with anybody, any state agency, and it's got some important privacy provisions around it. But they are piloting that because there's such a massive undercount of the individuals, and we have a very dated figure of 30% of Native Americans rate or something like that, and so we extrapolated how many millions of Native Americans aren't voting. But I don't even like to use that number because it feels very wrong. But I think and often that number is correlated to registered voters that don't vote, and it turns out there's a large number of registered Native voters that don't vote because of the barriers. But that's not even capturing the unregistered voters, of which there are much more, I think.
Yeah, so they do have some tribes, I would say like Pasquayaqui in Arizona, who they work with the county, but the counties can very easily share their voter registration database, and you can run that through your tribal membership. So then they target people, like they have different tribes that will then target people for voter registration drives, but we do not have an answer for you with regards to that number, which is very unfortunate. And I think it's even worse for 2020 because, people thought that they were going to have more time, and then they didn't have more time for the census. And it's very problematic.
Is there any particular state that's doing this well? Do you find that mail voting helps or hurts? Is there a model that can be exported to the other 49 states?
Doing what part well?
Native voting, all of the things. Yeah.
To your vote by mail point, which I think is important. So we've actually we think more voting options is always better, right? And in Indian country, even in states like Oregon, we have a problem with vote by mail because there are homes that do not have residential mail delivery. And if you don't have residential mail delivery, then an all vote by mail system doesn't make sense. And so, Washington State has vote centers now, and so we endorse a dual model of, vote centers and mail. And Colorado has also implemented vote centers and then having the vote centers on reservation. And we saw participation in Colorado go from 30% to 70% with an on-reservation vote center, as opposed to allowing for, and Colorado's an all-mail state. So we're not opposed to vote by mail. We are opposed to all vote by mail.
Yeah, I think during the 2020 election, there were some exercises to see how long it takes for the mail to be delivered on the reservation and returned back, and sometimes that's like 12 to 14 days. And so your early voting period in Arizona, for example, is 29 days. And so if you don't receive mail at home and you have a P.O. box, you have to drive to the P.O. box, which could be an hour away. They're only open at like limited days and hours. So on Saturday, maybe they're open till noon. You know, they're only open till 4 during the week. And so some people only check their mail once a month. But by the time you receive it, you would have to like fill it out at the post office and return it. And then the added problem in Arizona is they have a ballot collection law where other people can't bring your mail anywhere, and it's against the law. It's a crime unless they live in your household or a caregiver, a family member. And so that's problematic because people share mailboxes because there's actually not enough mailboxes, and there's not transportation, like there's all of these other barriers. So having additional options is helpful. Having early voting opportunities in tribal communities has resulted in an increase in voting. And sometimes you have to sue to get those.
California's not bad.
Question to the group, like, has anybody here actually done poll observing? So I've done it a few times with Native Vote and
Poll observing or election protection?
Nonpartisan poll, sitting there,
Okay.
watching to make sure that people vote. And
Yeah.
that's, I think, a very key part of this discussion is doing it on a nonpartisan basis, right? Because if you go, there are usually poll watchers who are with a specific party, and they often come off as intimidating. I've had the opportunity for, I guess it's maybe 3 times now, to go, I'm based in California, but to go to South Dakota, both on Rosebud as well as in Eagle Butte, and be a nonpartisan poll observer through Native Vote. And it is an absolutely different experience than if you are an urban voter, whether you're Native or not. And for anybody who hasn't done, on the nonpartisan side, some sort of election protection work, I would highly encourage you to do so. But for example, one of the things I think, Jacqueline, that you brought out was the locations. When you go to some of these places, it's not a common, I mean, the best place is like a community center or a senior food distribution center where people are used to going, but oftentimes it's like a church on a border town, which nobody goes to, and by the way, it's 30 miles from the most thing that they would go to. But another issue is that sometimes the precinct seems to change very frequently, which is very, very confusing for a person who's taken a half an hour out of their time, their day, or 30 minutes or an hour out of their day to get one place to be told, oh, that was the precinct for last year. You actually have to go, an hour and a half this way to vote. That person's not going to vote. It's just simply not going to happen. So I think, getting out that information is absolutely imperative. The other thing that you see when you are in Indian country is oftentimes the tribal elections will happen around the same time, and people have the attitude of, I've already voted in my tribal election, which is the one that they're probably going to vote in. Why do I need to vote in this other election? So if there's any impediment, then they've already, gone to one polling place, going an hour and a half to another one is highly unlikely. But I think the role of bar associations, either be it through NANABA or the ABA or local, even non-native bar associations, can be really valuable in just having somebody show up, because the poll workers, they're trying to do, most of the time they're trying to do things right, but they may not understand the rules. They're not lawyers. They're people who received a half an hour of training and are in a hurry, and people are impatient. So just something to think of if you haven't done it. It can be a very eye-opening experience, meaningful experience.
Yeah, that's helpful, thanks. And, I think we do provide some training. So I think, it's not like you're going to go out there totally alone, and we'll be available by phone all the time. We don't ever want to put yourself in danger. We have a de-escalation training along with sort of the other types of trainings that, are helpful. But, and we also, I think, I want to mention, do try and create voter guides, with specific Native, but our capacity is limited. So we partner a lot with law schools and other pro bono attorneys to help us develop those guides. So if you're more of a pen paper person and are interested in volunteering, you can reach out to NARF in that capacity as well, because chasing down those laws that have been changing with a lot of frequency is helpful.
Excuse me.
Oh, yes.
Have you faced any issues when you say you want to target certain areas if the protection workers are not admitted in that state?
It's not legal work.
Even if you're trying to explain to the poll workers that under the law that okay.
No, that hasn't been a problem. You can pull up, a lot of people go to different states. So you're not representing anyone.
Lawyers are helpful because I think, are familiar with laws, right, in a way that it's like just you can translate that much quicker than a layman can, but that is not a requirement.
And I will say, in some states, they don't allow nonpartisan poll watchers. Like, it's really great, the states that have that, because if you're in the polls, like, you can see what's happening. But in other states, you have to be outside. Yeah, so.
And that's another part of our training. So in some states, if you get relegated outside, the other issue here, too, is to remember is it's difficult to vote in Indian country because you're in South Dakota in November.
Yeah.
and it's, -20, or, and the road is frozen, and, there's a wind chill. And so, we are you might be the one with the best vehicle, actually, in that reservation community, because you'd rent a road-capable vehicle. But, some folks were sitting in their cars and then would ask people as they came out how it went.
So, this is just a really crazy thing I just want to mention. In the 2022 general election, the day of the election, it was like this solstice. And for Navajo people, they couldn't be outside until daylight. And so the polls opened before daylight. So that's why we had a number of polling locations that opened late, because the counties didn't think about, because they have like Navajo poll workers, right, which is great. You want people from those communities, but they couldn't eat, they couldn't sleep or do anything during that time period. So we're like, how many polls are going to open late today? But it wasn't anything that the county had thought about in advance. So that was just.
Oh, and one other factor I want to just highlight in terms of why polling places shut down, and it seems like it's benign, but it's not. And it goes back to the counting, right? Like the undercount. So, folks think that, there's sometimes state laws that say, if there's less than 100 people, you don't need to have a polling place, right? And because we have these drastic undercounts, even under 1,000 people, you don't need to have a polling place. And, you end up having polling places shut down that might have previously been open that are near or on a reservation because not enough people came out the last election. And then it's just like a really terrible cycle, right? Of like, of course there's not 1,000 people registered there because there's no polling place. Like, of course there, and there's no registration opportunity. So it just becomes a death spiral.
That sounds very negative. So I would like to see if anyone has anything positive. Oh, go ahead. Okay, use the mic, please. It's on already.
Can you talk about NAVRA and what we can do to support that effort?
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing it up. So the Native American Voting Rights Act is the only bipartisan piece of voting legislation that's been proposed. It is co-sponsored by all Native Congress people, so Representative Cole, who's a Republican from Oklahoma, Mary Peltola from Alaska, and Sharice Davids in Kansas, and Senator Lujan is the lead sponsor in the Senate. And, this legislation is, I think, common sense, right? So it's actually shocking to most Americans that are unfamiliar with Indian country that these types of barriers exist. And they sort of say, I thought that everybody had a polling place. Why don't you just put the polling places on the reservation? And the answer is yes, why don't we put the polling places on the reservation? And it turns out, though, we need a federal mandate because, unfortunately, the counties and states are not willing to do it. We've asked, they've said no. And so, it mandates early voting, registration, and on-reservation polling places in parity with the rest of the state. So that's one part. Another part is mandatory acceptance of tribal IDs, not requiring a residential address on that ID, and provisions that would codify making federal agencies that primarily service Indian lands and people, NAVRA, NVRA registration sites. Again, bipartisan legislation. It's helpful to talk about it whenever you're talking about voting. And to talk about it in non-native spaces as well to normalize it.
Great. Well, we're at the 30-minute mark. I just wanted to see if anyone else had a question.
I have just one more question. So, all of the tribes elect their tribal leaders and the members of the council. So I'm thinking that the numbers that vote there are good. So what is it that they are doing to get people out, and what can we adopt from that to make this voting better when we're at federal and state elections?
Yeah, so I think that goes back to, the trust in the government that came out through the survey, is that many people didn't trust the state or the federal government due to the history of, the Native Americans and how Native Americans have been treated. But there were also some people who didn't trust their tribal government when they filled out that survey, but it was like less than the state and federal government, just to be clear.
So I do think there's a role, right? And we've been working with tribal governments to request on-reservation polling places and seeing if they're open to coordinating their tribal elections with state and federal elections so that there's a, synergy. Unfortunately, a lot of it has to do with cultural considerations that, the timelines can't be moved, and that makes sense. And, some of them aren't voting necessarily, they're elected traditionally. And then sometimes there are issues with precincts, actually. So like in Navajo, if we were to put the elections on election day, which they did,
they are, yeah.
There's a problem because your traditional base where you would vote for an election is very far from where you may be living. And so people make the trip to vote in their traditional election, and they will preference their traditional election over the state and federal election. So now they're in conflict, and that's not something we want. So it's like literally a tribe by tribe consideration as to whether or not a synergy can be established.
So Navajo did change their tribal election date so that they could improve voter turnout. But even whenever they're within the county, the way the county may create the precinct, even though they vote within their political subdivision, which is their chapter, the precinct lines may cut up that political subdivision. So that would be a request for the counties to, hey, why can't your political subdivisions align with ours? But sometimes the county lines divide the tribal political subdivision. So they do have a number of tribes who have done that to encourage voter turnout, and they co-locate their tribal elections with state and federal elections. But in instances where they're not, and you're saying state and, your state precinct polling location, is different from your tribal polling location, then you have to make a choice, because it could be an hour and a half or, something like that. And then you're like, okay, well, I'm going to vote in the tribal elections. But there are places and tribes that have done that. And there are other tribes who have done a lot of work on GOTV, and they feel like In one tribe, for example, the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community, they had billboards, they're doing all kinds of things, and in the midterm, their turnout was not very good. So they're like, what are we doing wrong? And actually that tribe says, we need to do focus groups to figure out, are we even going to be able to reach these voters? Or maybe they're not responding to the social media. You know, maybe there's another way that we need to reach them, to have them, you know, participate and want to participate. Like, what else can we do? A lot of tribes who have been focused on voter education. But the midterms, there's not as much turnout anyway, but, you know, they were like, we invested so much in this. Why aren't people turning out? We have billboards on the street. So, yeah, so I think it's a really good question. And I think the tribes are looking at that. Like, how do we promote people to turn out? Because it makes such a difference in the daily lives of our people.
And I think it's a good ending note, actually, and I think a good thing is that consulting with the tribes themselves will lead you to the answer almost always, right? So I think a lot of time we can do a lot of external brainstorming and thoughts about sort of how structurally we can approach it, but actually sort of opening up a line of communication with the tribes themselves is going to get you the type of regional answer and the type of specific answer that you need. And I think the county tribal communications is what needs to be facilitated the most. And there is a role for attorneys, local attorneys, to help facilitate that.
Yeah, for sure. Paula?
Hi, everyone. I'm the director of the section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. I just want to thank you for having this important panel and just this discussion. And with our Perfecting Democracy project, I know you've already worked with Elizabeth, but we want to make sure that when you are trying to sign people up and when we're signing people up, that we can also provide the volunteers to you that are willing to go in different places. One of the things that we are making sure of is that we know the states that everyone is willing to go to. And so we are happy to work, and I've written down the states that you most need help with Nanaba's project as well as NARF's project and obviously Patty in ASU and in Arizona. So we are here to help. And thank you so much for this.
Great. Thank you all very much. We appreciate you.